King Philip's War, sometimes called the First Indian War, Metacom's War, Metacomet's War, or Metacom's Rebellion, was an armed conflict between Native American inhabitants of present-day New England and English colonists and the Native American allies in 1675–78. The war is named for the main leader of the Native American side, Metacomet, who had adopted the English name King Philip, in honor of the previously friendly relations between his father and the original Mayflower Pilgrims. The war continued in the most northern reaches of New England until the signing of the Treaty of Casco Bay in April 1678. Metacom was the second son of Wampanoag chief Massasoit, who had coexisted peacefully with the Pilgrims. Metacom succeeded his father in 1662 and reacted against the European settlers' continued encroaching onto Wampanoag lands. At Taunton in 1671, he was humiliated when colonists forced him to sign a new peace agreement that included the surrender of Indian guns. When officials in Plymouth colony hanged 3 Wampanoags in 1675 for the murder of a Christianized Indian, Metacom's alliance launched a united assault on colonial towns throughout the region. Metacom's forces enjoyed initial victories in the first year, but then the Native American alliance began to unravel. By the end of the conflict, the Wampanoags and the Narragansett allies were almost completely destroyed. Metacom anticipated their defeat and returned to his ancestral home at Mount Hope, where he was killed while walking in the forest. The war was the single greatest calamity to occur in 17th-century Puritan New England and is considered by many to be the deadliest war in the history of European settlement in North America in proportion to the population. In the space of little more than a year, 12 of the region's towns were destroyed and many more damaged. The colony's economy was all but ruined, and its population was decimated, losing 1/10 of all men available for military service. More than half of New England's towns were attacked by Native American warriors. King Philip's War began the development of a greater European-American identity. The colonists' trials, without significant English government support, gave them a group identity separate and distinct from that of subjects of the king. Historical context: the Pilgrims who arrived on the Mayflower and founded Plymouth Plantation expended great effort in forging friendship and peace with the Native Americans around Cape Cod. They traveled long distances to make peace with Chief Massasoit, and Governor William Bradford made a gift of his magnificent and prized red horse coat upon seeing that the chief admired it. Chief Massasoit gave his sons English names. Yet over the next 50 years, frictions and misunderstandings multiplied as wave after wave of Puritans and non-religious strangers kept arriving, often oblivious to the fragile peace carefully woven since the earliest arrivals. By 1675, the early efforts at friendship failed. King Philip's War joined the Powhatan Wars of 1610–14, 1622–32 and 1644–46 in Virginia, the Pequot War of 1637 in Connecticut, the Dutch Indian War of 1643 along the Hudson River, and the Iroquois Beaver Wars of 1650, and a list of ongoing uprisings and conflicts between various Native American tribes and the French, Dutch, and English colonial settlements of Canada, New York, and New England. Plymouth, Massachusetts, was established in 1620 with significant early help from local Native Americans, particularly Squanto and Massasoit, chief of the Wampanoag tribe. Subsequent colonists founded Salem, Boston, and many small towns around Massachusetts Bay between 1628 and 1640. At a time of increased English immigration, with a wave of immigration, and the building of towns such as Windsor, Connecticut, Newbury, Massachusetts, Hartford, Connecticut, Springfield, Massachusetts, Northampton, Massachusetts, and Providence, Rhode Island. The colonists progressively encroached on the traditional territories of the several Algonquin-speaking tribes in the region. Prior to King Philip's War, tensions fluctuated between tribes of Native Americans and the colonists, but relations were generally peaceful. 20,000 colonists settled in New England during the Great Migration. Colonial officials of the Rhode Island, Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut and the New Haven colonies each developed separate relations with the Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Narragansett, Mohegan, Pequot, and other tribes of New England, whose territories historically had differing boundaries. Many of the neighboring tribes had been traditional competitors and enemies. As the colonial population increased, the New Englanders expanded their settlements along the region's coastal plain and up the Connecticut River Valley. By 1675 they had established a few small towns in the interior between Boston and the Connecticut River settlements. The Wampanoag tribe, under Metacomet's leadership, had entered into an agreement with the Plymouth colony and believed that they could rely on the colony for protection. However, in the decades preceding the war it became clear to them that the treaty did not protect them from English expansion, and land they had lost appeared to be given to rival Christian Indian tribes. Disease and war throughout the Northeast. The Native Americans had suffered severe population losses as a result of pandemics of smallpox, spotted fever, typhoid, and measles, infectious diseases carried by European fishermen, starting in about 1618. 2 years before the first colony at Plymouth had been settled, shifting alliances among the different Algonquin peoples, represented by leaders such as Massasoit, Sassacus, Uncash and Ninigret, and the colonial polities negotiated a troubled peace for several decades. For almost half a century after the colonists' arrival, Massasoit of the Wampanoag had maintained an uneasy alliance with the English to benefit from their trade goods and as a counterweight to his tribe's traditional enemies, the Pequot, Narragansett, and the Mohegan. Massasoit had to accept colonial incursion into Wampanoag territory as well as English political interference with his tribe. Maintaining good relations with the English became increasingly difficult, as the English colonists continued pressuring the Indians to sell land. Failure of diplomacy. Metacomet became sachem of the Pokanoket and Grand Sachem of the Wampanoag Confederacy after the death in 1662 of his older brother, the Grand Sachem Wamsutta. The latter had succeeded their father Massasoit as chief, well known to the English before his ascension as paramount chief to the Wampanoag. Metacomet distrusted the colonists. Wamsutta had been visiting the Marshfield home of Josiah Winslow, the governor of the Plymouth colony, for peaceful negotiations, and became ill after being given a portion of working physic by a Dr. Fuller. The Plymouth colonists had put in place laws making it illegal to do commerce with the Wampanoags. When they found out that Wamsutta had sold a parcel of land to Roger Williams, Josiah Winslow, the governor of the Plymouth colony, had Wamsutta arrested even though Wampanoags that lived outside of colonist jurisdiction were not accountable to Plymouth colony laws. Wamsutta's wife, Weetamo, attempted to bring the chief back to Pokanoket. However, on the Taunton River the party saw that the end was near, and after beaching their canoes, Wamsutta died under an oak tree within viewing distance of Mount Hope. Metacomet began negotiating with the other Algonquin tribes against the Plymouth colony soon after the deaths of his father Massasoit and his brother Wamsutta. His action was a reaction to the colonists' refusal to stop buying land and establishment of new settlements. Combined with Wamsutta, Alexander's suspicious death. Population. The population of New England immigrants from Europe totaled about 80,000 people. They lived in 110 towns, of which 64 were in the Massachusetts colony, which then included the southwestern portion of the present state of Maine. The towns had about 16,000 men of military age who were almost all part of the militia. Universal training was prevalent in all colonial New England towns. Many towns had built strong garrison houses for defense, and others had stockades enclosing most of the houses. All of these were strengthened as the war progressed. Some poorly populated towns without enough men to defend them were abandoned. Each town had local militias based on all eligible men, who had to supply their own arms. Only those who were too old, too young, disabled, or clergy were excused from military service. The militias were usually only minimally trained and initially did relatively poorly against the warring Indians until more effective training in tactics could be devised. Joint forces of militia volunteers and volunteer Indian allies were found to be the most effective. The officers were usually elected by popular vote of the militia members. The Indian allies of the colonists, the Mohegans and Praying Indians, numbered about 1,000, with about 200 warriors. By 1676, the regional Native American population had decreased to about 10,000 Indians, largely because of epidemics. These included about 4,000 Narragansett of western Rhode Island and eastern Connecticut, 2,400 Nipmuc of central and western Massachusetts, and 2,400 combined in the Massachusetts and Pawtucket tribes, living about Massachusetts Bay and extending northwest to Maine. The Wampanoag and Pokanoket of Plymouth and eastern Rhode Island are thought to have numbered fewer than 1,000. About 1 in 4 were considered to be warriors. By then the Indians had almost universally adopted steel knives, tomahawks, and flintlock muskets as their weapons of choice. The various tribes had no common government. They had distinct cultures and often warred among themselves. Despite different cultures, they all spoke related languages from the Algonquin family. The trial John Sassamon, a Native American convert to Christianity, a so-called praying Indian, played a key role as a cultural mediator, negotiating with both sides while belonging to neither. An early graduate of Harvard College, he served as a translator and advisor to Metacomet. He reported to the governor of Plymouth Colony that Metacomet planned to gather allies for Native American attacks on widely dispersed colonial settlements. Metacomet was brought before a public court, where court officials admitted they had no proof, but warned that if they had any further reports against him they would confiscate Wampanoag land and guns. Not long after, Sassamon's body was found in the ice-covered Assoramset Pond. Whether his death was the result of accident, suicide or murder was disputed at the time and since. Plymouth Colony officials arrested 3 Wampanoag, including one of Metacomet's counselors. On the testimony of a Native American, a jury that included 6 Indian elders convicted the men of Sassamon's murder. They were executed by hanging on June 8, 1675, at Plymouth. Some Wampanoag believed that both the trial and the court sentence infringed on Wampanoag sovereignty. Southern Theatre, 1675. Raid on Swansea in response to the trial and executions. On June 20, 1675, a band of Pokanoket attacked several isolated homesteads in the small Plymouth Colony settlement of Swansea. Laying siege to the town, they destroyed it 5 days later and killed several people. On June 27, 1675, a full eclipse of the moon occurred in the New England area. Various tribes in New England looked at it as a good omen for attacking the colonists. Officials from the Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay colonies responded quickly to the attacks on Swansea. On June 28, they sent a punitive military expedition that destroyed the Wampanoag town at Mount Hope. In 1675, King Philip's War came to Freetown, either on June 27, 1675, as reported to the Plymouth court by Shadrach Wilbur, or on April 4, 1675, as stated in a letter by John Freeman, an officer in the war. John Tisdale was killed by Indians. It was reported that 3 men were slain: John Tisdale, Sr., John Knowles and Samuel Atkins. John Tisdale's house was burned, as was the house of his brother-in-law James Walker. John's gun was carried off by the Indians. The gun was retaken at Rehoboth on August 1, 1675, where it was found with the body of an Indian who was slain there. The gun was later used as evidence in court. Sarah Walker Tisdale did not outlive her husband by much. She died on December 10, 1676, in Taunton. John's estate was settled on March 6, 1677. That same day, 3 Indians, Timothy Jacked, Massamaquat and Pompachonch, were indicted for the murder of John and the other 2 men, on the evidence of having John's gun. Charges against one were dropped for lack of evidence. The other 2 were deemed probably guilty. All 3 were sold into slavery, and removed from the country. The war quickly spread, and soon involved the Poduncan Nipmuc tribes. During the summer of 1675, the Native Americans attacked at Middleborough and Dartmouth, Mendon, Brookfield, and Lancaster. In early September they attacked Deerfield, Hadley, and Northfield. Siege of Brookfield. Wheeler's surprise, and the ensuing siege of Brookfield, was a battle between Nipmuc Indians under Metacomet and the English of the Massachusetts Bay Colony under the command of Thomas Wheeler and Captain Edward Hutchinson, in August 1675. The battle consisted of an initial ambush by the Nipmucs on Wheeler's unsuspecting party, followed by an attack on Brookfield, Massachusetts, and the consequent besieging of the remains of the colonial force. While the place where the siege part of the battle took place has always been known, the location of the initial ambush was a subject of extensive controversy among historians in the late 19th century. The New England Confederation, comprising the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Plymouth Colony, New Haven Colony and Connecticut Colony, declared war on the Native Americans on September 9, 1675. The colony of Rhode Island and Providence plantations, settled mostly by Puritan dissidents, tried to remain mostly neutral, but like the Narragansett they were dragged inexorably into the conflict. The next colonial expedition was to recover crops from abandoned fields along the Connecticut River for the coming winter and included almost 100 farmers, militia plus teamsters to drive the wagons. Battle of Bloody Brook. The Battle of Bloody Brook was fought on September 12, 1675, between English colonial militia from the Massachusetts Bay Colony and a band of Indians led by the Nipmucs Metacomet. The Indians ambushed colonists escorting a train of wagons carrying the harvest from Deerfield to Hadley. They killed at least 40 militiamen and 17 teamsters out of a company that included 79 militia. Attack on Springfield. The Indians next attacked on October 5, 1675, against the Connecticut River's largest settlement at the time, Springfield, Massachusetts. They burned to the ground nearly all of Springfield's buildings, including the town's grist mill. Most of the Springfielders who escaped unharmed took cover at the house of Miles Morgan, a resident who had constructed one of Springfield's few fortified block houses. An Indian servant who worked for Morgan managed to escape and later alerted the Massachusetts Bay troops under the command of Major Samuel Appleton, who broke through to Springfield and drove off the attackers. Morgan's sons were famous Indian fighters in the territory. His son Pelisha was killed by Indians in 1675. Springfielders later honored Miles Morgan with a large statue in Court Square. The Narragansett had not been directly involved in the war, but they had sheltered many of the Wampanoag women and children. Several of their warriors were reported in several Indian raiding parties. The colonists distrusted the tribe and did not understand the various alliances. As the colonial forces went through Rhode Island, they found and burned several Indian towns which had been abandoned by the Narragansett, who had retreated to a massive fort in a frozen swamp. The cold weather in December froze the swamp so it was relatively easy to traverse. Led by a guide, Indian Peter, on a very cold December 19, 1675, the colonial force found the Narragansett fort near present-day South Kingstown, Rhode Island. A combined force of Plymouth, Massachusetts, and Connecticut militia numbering about 1,000 men, including about 150 Pequots and Mohican Indian allies, attacked the Indian fort. The fierce battle that followed is known as the Great Swamp Fight. It is believed that the militia killed about 600 Narragansett. The militia burned the fort of land, and destroyed most of the tribe's winter stores. Most of the Narragansett warriors and their families escaped into the frozen swamp. Facing a winter with little food and shelter, the entire surviving Narragansett tribe was forced out of quasi-neutrality and joined the fight. The colonists lost many of their officers in this assault. About 70 of their men were killed and nearly 150 more wounded. Lacking supplies for an extended campaign, the rest of the colonial assembled forces returned to their homes. The nearby towns in Rhode Island provided care for the wounded until they could return to their homes. Native American campaign throughout the winter of 1675 to 76. Native Americans attacked and destroyed more frontier settlements in their effort to expel the English colonists. Attacks were made at Andover, Bridgewater, Chelmsford, Groton, Lancaster, Marlborough, Medfield, Medford, Millis, Portland, Providence, Rehoboth, Scituate, Seekonk, Simsbury, Sudbury, Suffield, Warwick, Weymouth, and Wrentham, including what is modern-day Norfolk and Plainville. The famous account written and published by Mary Rowlandson after the war gives a colonial captive's perspective on the conflict.